I spent that weekend organizing my files. I had 6 years of documentation stored in a filing cabinet in my spare room. Every batch record, every environmental monitoring report, every equipment calibration log, every safety audit I'd conducted. I'd kept copies because that's what the job required. When you manage pharmaceutical production, you don't rely on company servers. You maintain redundancy. You keep proof that procedures were followed. I created a digital backup of everything, scanned documents, indexed by date and batch number. 342 files total. I uploaded them to 2 separate cloud storage accounts. Then I reviewed the termination letter again. Section 12.4 of the Employee Handbook covered safety documentation requirements. I pulled my copy of the handbook from my files. I'd received it on my first day and had reviewed it annually during performance evaluations. Section 12.4 stated, production managers shall maintain complete and accurate records of all safety procedures, environmental controls, and quality documentation in accordance with regulatory requirements. I'd done exactly that. I checked my employment contract next. 14 pages. Standard terms for a salaried manager position. Section 9 covered termination procedures. For terminations related to policy violations, the company was required to provide written notice of the specific violation, an opportunity to respond, and documentation supporting the termination decision. I'd received none of those things. I made notes in a separate document. Timeline, facts, contract provisions. Then I waited. I didn't contact the company for 8 days. I didn't call HR. I didn't email my former supervisor. I didn't post on professional networks about looking for new work. I filed for unemployment benefits. The application asked for the reason I'd left my last position. I wrote, terminated. Employer cited policy violation, but provided no supporting documentation. I submitted the application on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I received a call from an employment solicitor I'd found through the Law Society of Ireland. Her name was Siobhan Brennan. Her practice focused on employment disputes and wrongful termination cases. I explained the situation in 15 minutes. She asked if I'd received written warning prior to termination. I said no. She asked if I'd been given an opportunity to respond to the allegations. I said no. She asked if I had documentation supporting my work performance. I said yes. 6 years of compliance records. She said I had grounds for an unfair dismissal claim. She said Irish employment law required fair procedures before termination. She said the company had violated those procedures. She asked about my willingness to pursue the case. I asked about costs and timeline. She said she could take it on contingency if the case was strong enough. She said she'd need to review my documentation first. She said these cases typically took 6 to 12 months. I sent her the files that afternoon. She called me back 3 days later. She said the documentation was comprehensive. She said it clearly demonstrated compliance with safety requirements. She said she'd take the case. We signed a representation agreement the following Monday. Siobhan sent a formal letter to the company on day 17 after my termination. The letter requested specific information: the documentation supporting my termination, the policy violations I'd allegedly committed, any written warnings or disciplinary records from my employment. She gave them 14 days to respond. I didn't hear anything directly from the company. But on day 19, I received a letter from Ireland's Health Products Regulatory Authority, the HPRA. The letter was addressed to me personally at my home address. It stated that the HPRA was conducting a routine follow-up inspection of the pharmaceutical plant where I'd worked. It said they'd reviewed records from a recent inspection and had questions about certain manufacturing batches. It requested that I provide copies of batch records, environmental monitoring data, and equipment calibration logs for a specific 6-month period. The period covered my final 6 months of employment. The letter said the request was part of standard regulatory oversight. It said I could submit the records electronically within 21 days. I read the letter 4 times. The company had fired me for failing to maintain compliance documentation. The regulatory agency was asking me for that same documentation. I called Siobhan. She said this was significant. She said it suggested the company might not have the records themselves. She said if I provided them to the HPRA, it would demonstrate my compliance, while potentially exposing gaps in the company's systems. She said I should respond to the HPRA request. I spent 2 days organizing the requested files. I pulled every batch record for the specified period. I included environmental monitoring reports. I included calibration certificates. I included deviation reports and corrective action documentation. Everything the HPRA had asked for. Everything the company had said I failed to maintain. I submitted the files electronically on day 26 after my termination. The HPRA acknowledged receipt the same day. The company responded to Siobhan's letter on day 31. Their response came from an external law firm, a 2-page letter. It stated that my termination was lawful and based on documented performance deficiencies. It said I had failed to maintain required safety documentation. It said the decision was made in accordance with company policy. It did not provide any supporting documentation. It did not reference any written warnings. It did not include any specific examples of my alleged failures. Siobhan called me after receiving the letter. She said the response was inadequate. She said employment law required employers to provide specific grounds for termination. She said vague references to performance deficiencies weren't sufficient. She said we'd proceed with filing an unfair dismissal claim with the Workplace Relations Commission. She prepared the complaint over the next week. It outlined the facts: my 6 years of employment, my consistent performance, the sudden termination without warning or process, the company's failure to provide supporting documentation. We filed the claim on day 42. The company had 42 days to file a response. I didn't hear from the HPRA for 6 weeks after submitting the records. Then I received a phone call on a Thursday afternoon in January. The caller identified himself as an inspector with the HPRA's compliance division. His name was Michael O'Sullivan. He said he'd reviewed the documentation I'd submitted. He said it was thorough and well organized. He said it had raised some questions about the plant's current record-keeping practices. I didn't respond immediately. He said the HPRA was planning an inspection of the facility. He said they wanted to compare my records with the company's current files. He asked if I'd be willing to answer questions about the manufacturing processes during my tenure. I said I'd need to consult with my solicitor. He said that was fine. He gave me his direct contact information. I called Siobhan immediately after the call ended. She said this was the leverage we needed. She said if the HPRA found discrepancies between my records and the company's records, it would support my claim that I'd been properly maintaining documentation. She said it would undermine the company's stated reason for my termination. She said I should cooperate with the HPRA. I called Michael O'Sullivan back the next day. I said I'd answer questions about my work. I said I wanted any conversation to be documented in writing. He agreed. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. The meeting took place at the HPRA offices in Dublin City Centre. 2 inspectors attended, Michael O'Sullivan and a senior compliance officer named Patricia Hayes. They asked me to walk through my record-keeping procedures, how I documented batch production, how I maintained environmental monitoring data, how I tracked equipment calibration. I explained each process in detail. I showed them examples from the files I'd submitted. They asked if the company had access to these same records during my employment. I said yes. Everything was stored in both the plant's document control system and in my personal backup files. They asked why I maintained personal backups. I said it was standard practice in pharmaceutical manufacturing. I said managers typically kept redundant copies to ensure nothing was lost during system updates or server migrations. They made notes throughout the conversation. At the end of the meeting, Patricia Hayes said the HPRA would be conducting their inspection within the next month. She said they'd request the same records from the company. She thanked me for my cooperation. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The company filed its response to my unfair dismissal claim on day 78 after my termination. The response was 8 pages. It repeated the same claims as their solicitor's letter: poor performance, failure to maintain documentation, lawful termination. But it still didn't include supporting evidence. Siobhan filed a request for further particulars. She asked the company to provide specific examples of my alleged failures. She asked for copies of any written warnings. She asked for the safety documentation they claimed I'd failed to maintain. She gave them 21 days to respond. On day 84, I received another call from Michael O'Sullivan. He said the HPRA had completed their inspection of the plant. He said they'd requested the same batch records I'd provided. He said the company had been unable to produce several of them. He said the company claimed the records had been lost when I left. I asked if that was a compliance violation. He said pharmaceutical manufacturers were required to maintain complete batch records for all products. He said missing records could result in regulatory action. He said the HPRA was issuing a warning letter to the company. He said they'd require a corrective action plan within 30 days. He thanked me again for my cooperation. I documented the call in my case file. The company's response to Siobhan's request for particulars arrived on day 101. It was 3 pages. It included one new piece of information. The company claimed I'd been verbally warned about documentation deficiencies 3 months before my termination. They said the warning had been delivered by the HR director during a private meeting. They said no written record was made because it was an informal coaching session. They still provided no documentation of the alleged deficiencies. Siobhan called me after reviewing the response. She said the claim about a verbal warning was problematic for the company. She said Irish employment law required employers to document disciplinary actions. She said undocumented, informal coaching couldn't justify termination. She said the HPRA's findings strengthened our case. She said the company's inability to produce records I'd maintained demonstrated that I'd been performing my job properly. She said we were in a strong position heading into the hearing. The Workplace Relations Commission scheduled our hearing for March, 4 months after my termination. On day 112, I received an email from the company's external solicitor. The subject line read, "Settlement Discussion." The email was brief. It said the company was interested in resolving the matter without a hearing. It asked if I'd be willing to discuss settlement terms. I forwarded the email to Siobhan. She called me within an hour. She said this was expected. She said the HPRA warning letter had likely created urgency for the company. She said they didn't want a public hearing where their compliance issues would be discussed. She asked what outcome I wanted. I said I wanted fair compensation for the wrongful termination. I said I wanted my employment record corrected. I said I didn't want to return to the company. She said she'd communicate those terms. She sent a response to their solicitor that afternoon. She proposed a settlement meeting for the following week. The meeting took place in a conference room at the company's solicitor's office. 6 people attended. Their side: the company's solicitor, the HR director who'd terminated me, and the plant director. Our side: Siobhan, a barrister she'd brought for support, and me. I wore the same professional clothes I'd worn to the HPRA meeting. Navy trousers, white blouse, no jewelry. The HR director didn't make eye contact when I entered. The company's solicitor opened the meeting. He said they wanted to resolve this efficiently. He said both sides had valid perspectives. He said litigation was expensive for everyone. Siobhan said nothing. I said nothing. He presented an offer. The company would pay me 3 months' salary. They would provide a neutral reference. They would withdraw their response to the unfair dismissal claim. I would withdraw my complaint. I would sign a confidentiality agreement. I would agree not to discuss the circumstances of my departure. Siobhan asked for a recess. We stepped into the hallway. She said the offer was inadequate. She said wrongful dismissal awards in Ireland typically ranged from 6 months to 2 years of compensation, depending on circumstances. She said my case was strong enough to justify at least 1 year. She said we should counter at 18 months' salary plus correction of my employment record. I agreed. We returned to the conference room. Siobhan presented our counteroffer. The company's solicitors said they'd need to discuss it with their client. The meeting ended after 70 minutes. They responded 5 days later with a revised offer. 9 months' salary, neutral reference, correction of my personnel file to remove any reference to performance deficiencies, mutual confidentiality. Siobhan said it was a reasonable compromise. She said we could push for more, but there was risk in going to a hearing. She said the decision was mine. I asked about the employment record correction. She said my file would show I'd left by mutual agreement. It would remove the termination for cause. Future employers checking references would see nothing negative. I asked about the timeline. She said we could finalize the settlement within 2 weeks. I thought about the HPRA inspection, the missing records, the warning letter. I thought about the HR director's face during the settlement meeting. I said yes. The settlement agreement was signed on day 134 after my termination. The company wired the payment the same day. 9 months' salary. After Siobhan's contingency fee, I received approximately 7 months' worth. My personnel file was amended within a week. I requested a copy through the company's HR department. The termination notice was gone. In its place was a brief notation. Employment ended by mutual agreement. Eligible for rehire. The unfair dismissal claim was formally withdrawn the following Monday. I received confirmation from the Workplace Relations Commission that the case was closed. I didn't contact anyone from the company after the settlement. I didn't discuss the case with former colleagues. I moved the settlement payment into my savings account. I spent the next month applying for jobs in pharmaceutical manufacturing, quality assurance roles, compliance management positions, manufacturing supervision. I had 3 interviews within the first 2 weeks. All 3 companies asked about my departure from the previous role. I said I'd left by mutual agreement to pursue new opportunities. All 3 companies requested references. The company provided neutral references as agreed. Employment dates, job title, confirmation of mutual separation. I received 2 job offers within 6 weeks of the settlement. I accepted a quality assurance manager position at a different pharmaceutical plant in Dublin. Similar role, higher salary, better benefits. I started the new position in May, 6 months after my termination. My new employer required regulatory compliance documentation during onboarding. I provided copies of my training certificates, audit records, and professional qualifications. Everything I'd maintained in my personal files. Everything the previous company had claimed I'd failed to document. I never heard from the HPRA again about the inspection. but I checked the public enforcement database periodically. The company received a second warning letter 4 months after my settlement. This one cited ongoing issues with batch record retention and document control procedures. They hired a new production floor manager 3 weeks after that. I saw the job posting on a pharmaceutical industry website. The requirements included meticulous attention to documentation and regulatory compliance. I saved a screenshot. I never needed to look at it again. I kept copies of the settlement agreement and the amended personnel file in a locked drawer in my home office, next to 6 years of compliance documentation that proved I'd been doing my job correctly all along. They'd fired me for failing to maintain records that regulators later requested from me personally. I'd provided those records while the company couldn't produce them. I'd received 9 months' salary and a clean employment record. I finished organizing my files and closed the drawer.